How would you describe the work of Rothamsted Research?
We're pretty much in the middle, in some ways. We're not here to promote any particular thing or product or practice based on ideological grounds or commercial interests. So we're a not-for-profit organization. Our reputation rests on 176 years of doing good science in an independent manner. That's what we are here for. Yeah. So we don't particularly get engaged in any of these arguments from an extreme point. We're interested in the scientific evidence behind these things, including some that don't have enough scientific credibility or evidence. Yeah. So if you take pesticides, for example, our view is that at least for the near term, we still need to have a certain use of chemical solutions for pest control as part of farming, but it needs to be of a new kind, or we call it smart crop protection. So instead of mindlessly spraying the hell out of your crop or through prophylactic schemes that say, okay, every 10 days we need to spray something, to prevent. So that is the old model. And that has caused the problems. We're killing too many things that we shouldn't be killing. We put chemicals on that aren't needed, end up in the groundwater or whatever, So instead of that, what we want is a holistic approach that basically says, okay, the first thing is to get a crop out there that has a higher level of inherent genetic resistance to insects or diseases, or may even attract certain beneficial ones. The second thing is that you use real-time monitoring information using new technology to always be a step ahead, to know what pathogens, what type of it, what strains are coming, when and where, or what insects are on the move. And they use that information then as a third component to target your interventions much more precisely. Whether it is an agronomic intervention or whether for certain things you need a chemical, that is another question. And then the fourth component is that increasingly we want to look to replace synthetic chemicals with more biological products. So that's, to me, is a package of practices that is an integrated approach to crop health management that avoids that farmers would have to take a huge amount of risk by not applying any chemicals. And maybe over time one can reduce reliance on pesticides even more. Because when you look at it, nobody really likes pesticides. The public doesn't like it, or regulators don't want, only want to take more of the market. Farmers, for them, it's a high cost and a health risk. And even the industry, if you look at it, finds it more and more difficult to actually come up with new stuff that works. So it's not a big part of the future of farming for me.
It's said that soil erosion is one of the most serious environmental and public health problems facing society. We hear things like half the topsoil in the Midwest in Iowa has disappeared in a century. What practices have brought us to that point?
The biggest issue is as soon as you start plowing up land, natural land, you will expose it for longer times of the year to weather and rain, and you lose it through either water erosion or wind erosion. And when you look at the Midwest in particular, the numbers that I've seen, for example, for Iowa, suggest that we've lost about, anywhere between 6 and 8 inches of topsoil in the last 150 years. So now whether that's half of the topsoil or not depends on what soil you have, because these are quite deep soils. So the annual rates are about 5-6 tons of soil per acre. And so that's obviously compared to nothing of that kind or very little erosion when it was under natural prairie largely. So the change in land use and the cultivation and exposure to the elements is the primary reason. And I think that's also where we can do something about it.
Now, this idea that we might run out of topsoil by 2050, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I don't think this is scientifically very credible because we've always had in the history of mankind various types of soil degeneration. So erosion is one of them, but others are more related to nutrient depletion, acidification, salinization, desertification, so various types of things, So some of them are reversible, I would say, through better management. So if you acidify the soil, of course, you can correct that loss of soil health function by applying lime, or growing things differently. Now, the bigger issue is, of course, that if you lose soil health, you lose essentially soil capital. And you actually need to replace that loss with a much more effort in terms of managing the soil to get the same out in terms of productivity of your crops or other ecosystem functions. So it is, in fact, an economic loss, and I think we do need to reduce it to a large extent possible. But any kind of human activity compared to a natural land use will change the way the soil is. It's inevitable.
Are there not tipping points in this sort of a situation? Look at the Mediterranean basin. People often, I think it was Dale Carter, is it? The book about topsoil and civilization, where he shows photographs around the Mediterranean basin. Well, it cannot be recovered.
Yes, I think the tipping point is really the physical loss. If you really have massive amounts of erosion or other types of things that essentially physically remove the soil, the fertile soil, that's very hard to rebuild because the building rate of soil fertility is much slower than the loss rate. So yes, we need to really, I think, avoid the extremes to where these things are happening because they're irreversible. I think what I'm talking about more is the large areas of agriculturally used land that are more exposed to slow changes by human activities, and we need to make sure that we do whatever we can do in terms of managing these soils properly to stop that kind of loss of function or even improve them. And I think that is possible if we do it right.
So a member of the public reading, for example, that every second the clock ticks, the Mississippi River carries the equivalent of a dump truck load of topsoil into the Gulf, why would they be inclined to think we're not in dire difficulties here?
No, I think we should be concerned, absolutely. And these are really concerning numbers. They're probably much bigger, even if you look at the Amazon or much bigger river systems of that kind, where rainfall is 2 or 3 times as much anyway. And you're getting really huge numbers. I mean, the public sees, of course, the immediate effect in the Gulf of Mexico, in the anoxic zone that typically is anywhere between 5,000-6,000 square miles each year. You can see it as algae blooms and dead fish and whatever. So, and in a way that is good because it draws attention to the problem, and it should also therefore, I think, encourage more efforts to do something about it. Now the question is, who is going to do what, and how do we also as public and the politicians that we elect support that? Because if we only blame it on the farmer, who then also has to bear all the cost of it, while we are the ones who are the consumers who want the cheap food that the farmer produces, that doesn't sound like a fair deal either. And the practices, the management practices that we can use to stop that kind of dramatic losses are well known. So if we had the ability to have somewhat more sophisticated crop rotations again, we can assure that we leave the soil covered for most of the year through cover crops in winter, through good management during the rest of the year, that we use more of the conservation agricultural practices of various kinds. It's not just no-till, there are others too, even reduced tillage or strip farming or ridge till, all the kind of systems that scientists and others have come up with over the decades. They exist and they have demonstrated impact, but the uptake is not enough. And that is, I think, an economic problem for farmers because it costs investment. It is a behavioral issue. You need to want it, of course. And some really invested on their own base, just based on that. And then it's a political question. So if politicians don't really encourage this through support systems that pay essentially farmers to do good practices. Only achieving it on voluntary basis, I don't think is feasible.
Now, Rothamsted, as I understand it, has a role in giving advice to politicians. We know politicians that are kind of interested in what's in their inbox tomorrow morning, or how they might get re-elected. How do you get past this inertia that's inevitably within a political structure?
It's difficult because we operate on different timescales in our thinking, and also probably in different sort of levels of holistic thinking. So for us in science, we try to look at the whole system. We look at all kind of questions, and then we try to come up with a recommendation that sort of considers everything. For a politician, that is often too complicated already. Politicians want simple solutions, simple messages, and on a time scale that is well shorter than electoral cycles. So and I think that's where we also struggle with here at Rothamsted. I mean, if I just look at the UK right now, how often ministers are changing. I think I'm on my 5th Secretary of Agriculture in the UK here in the 5 years that I've been here. So some of them have lasted less than a year, but they're meant to design and implement new policies. Now they come up with ideas and schemes, but they rarely are being held accountable to implement them. So for me as a scientist or a director of a well-known research institute, it is very difficult to change that. But I do think that we need to all do a better job in talking to these people on a consistent basis, and also on a relatively sort of simple message kind of basis, and also sometimes sort of compromise a bit in our own sort of scientific rigor. Translating these scientific messages into actionable policy advice is a bit of an art, and most of us are not very, very good at it yet.
You mentioned there's a difference between soil erosion and soil degradation. The UN says about 1/3 of the world's soil is now moderately to highly degraded. Tell us about what brings about soil degradation.
Yeah, I mean, when you travel through the world, even if you're just a lay person or a tourist, you can look at soils and you see the differences. If you go to the Midwest and you see dark mole soils, as we call them, or black earth soils, even though they have suffered from some degeneration from human activity, they are still miles better in terms of their fertility and other functions than, let's say, a soil in southern China that has been under 2,000 or 3,000 years of rice cultivation, and often has been exploited much more, in a sense that you grow 2 or 3 crops a year and not always receive the input back. So that soil in China will still be very productive because people have learned to live with this. But it's a different soil, and in that case, largely a reduction in chemical properties, nutrients or whatever. You may also have soils in China that, because of human activity, have actually accumulated too much nutrients. That is also possible. Overuse of fertilizer, which then has led to acidification as another form of degeneration, to lower an acid pH, which then affects the microbial life, the turnover of many processes, the crops and their functioning. And then I think the worst that I've seen is, of course, in countries or regions in the world where I think we've had essentially over centuries now only one form of agriculture, which is a low input agriculture. Or no input agriculture in some places, even not even organic inputs. So in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where you see that farmers have no access or no capability of buying fertilizer or manures, or not enough land to dedicate some of it to grow green manure crops or other types of nice things, you're basically doing one thing: you're mining the soil every year, and you grow a crop. And that is particularly a nutrient depletion or nutrient imbalance as a soil degeneration.
Can you explain the role of climate change in your analysis of soil erosion, degradation, and food security?
Well, I think it's very clear and very simple. It's just going to make everything worse, and much harder. So if you have drier conditions more often or more heat waves, it makes your soil so much more exposed, so less vegetation on the soil and exposed to heat and whatever, so it affects your turnover of soil organic matter negatively in a way, so you just don't have enough moisture to, for microbes to work things into stable organic matter. You're going to have more extreme rainfall events that essentially then also increase the erosion events or wind erosion. And in some parts of the world, we'll lose more highly productive agricultural land to the rising seawater levels. So if you look at the mega deltas in Asia, for example, where, it's altogether 30–40% of the world's rice comes from, and how low-lying some of those are, and you're going to get much more saltwater intrusion into these areas. The Mekong Delta is probably one of the primary examples. You already have a tidal influence from the coast that goes well over 100 kilometers inland, up and down, and with more of the seawater rising, it's going to essentially take land out of production or make it much harder for farmers to grow. And of course, essentially also then leads to soils that are saline or waterlogged or both. So yeah, it is a huge concern and affects everything.
Biodiversity also an issue. The FAO say that biodiversity in food and agriculture is indispensable to food security and sustainable development. But of course, as we know, biodiversity at all kinds of levels, insects, livestock, crop variety, are all in decline, making it difficult for agriculture to respond to, well, even normal, let alone increased food demands. Do we have any reason then to be optimistic in this area?
Concerns that people have about decreasing genetic diversity in crops or animals that we raise, and the other one is, just as another example, what appears to be a decline in insects and other beneficial species that one way or another are needed for agriculture. So both of them are not as straightforward as it appears on the surface. And the decline in genetic diversity is simply the result of human-induced selection and breeding processes. So it's driven by the consumer itself, or themselves, who want food of various kinds, of specific kind, and have gotten used to certain products that can only be made from these crops. What often is forgotten is some people say, well, farmers grow only a few modern varieties of a certain crop species. But what has actually happened, if I take rice as an example, is that each of these varieties has nowadays far more genetic diversity in them than they had 40 years ago. So when the Green Revolution started, with the breeding, IR8 was the first modern variety of this kind. It only had 3 ultimate land races in its parentage. But any new rice variety that's nowadays being released to a farmer in Asia will have about 20, sometimes 30, and including many unimproved land races or even wild rices nowadays. So breeders are using genes, useful genes from many of these diverse species in the breeding process. So from that point of view, we have found a way to create crops that are actually genetically more diverse than ever. And that is because we want them to be resistant to diseases. We want them to have this kind of taste or whatever, So that part is I think, mainly a question of, all right, what do future consumers want in terms of their diets? And farmers will respond by growing it, and breeders or others or scientists will make it happen. The other part, the things like insect decline or other biological functions, you could also argue, people will say, well, there's been a decline in microbial activities in soils, which is far less proven, by the way. I think we have a situation there that we, first of all, don't have a huge amount of reliable data to prove some of these things. And the other one is that, of course, as soon as we start changing land use anywhere in the world by going to a certain kind of agriculture, we will change the species diversity of these things, you know. So it's inevitable, you know. So if we want to reverse this for whatever reasons, so we need to go back to the landscape design or land use design question and say, okay, what is it that we want as people living on Earth, in terms of the environment that we want, but we also need to be able to produce that food, you know. So here in Rothamsted, we run, for example, the world's longest running and stable insect monitoring network. For over 50 years, we have a network of traps, different type, all over the country. So, and the methods have never changed. So we have pretty much one of the few only reliable time series. So we have seen a decline of certain moss species in some parts of the country, in the southern part, but we've also seen no changes in others or even increases in others. You know. So it's much more diverse than just a general loss, you know, but we are concerned about this, absolutely. You know.
This juxtaposition of human activity and nature is kind of an interesting nexus, isn't it? I think it's Wes Jackson, Land Institute in Kansas, who said basically we've unzipped the prairie. That's his way of expressing
good comparison, yeah.
What's happened in the Midwest. And of course, he's doing a lot of research into growing crops, but leaving basically the prairie cover in place. I'm sure you're familiar with some of that.
I mean, here in England, I know we've had hundreds of years ago already principles, not of the prairie kind, but ley farming, where as part of the rotation, you know, for a certain period, several years, you would put it on a grassland again, you know, and then you come back with a crop. You know, but similar ideas, and they're actually coming back nowadays. So I know quite a few farmers here who have in recent years essentially adopted not no-till farming systems of the American kind, but a mixture of reduced tillage and attempts to have more diversified crop rotations again, with more crops, not just wheat or oilseed rape or canola, and then also have cover crops in winter that often don't have a direct economic value for them. It's nothing that you can sell, but the main function is to cover the soil, to protect it, to bring back a bit more biological activity, and in many cases also actually tie up nitrate from the soil, because as this thing grows in winter and has deep root systems, brassicaceae species, for example, you mop up nitrate that otherwise would be leaching deeper out, and you actually make it available for the next crop. Yeah. So these are essentially agronomic or even agroecological principles that many are trying in different parts of the world. Now, whether this tries to get you back closer to what a prairie was, well, we didn't really have prairies here, you know, so we have to create something of a different kind that is adapted to our soils and our climate, but also our different markets for crops, you know. But essentially bringing back more of these agronomic and agroecologically sound practices into the modern kind of intensive farming is, for me, a huge part of the future solution.
So you wrote a paper, 2019, February 2019, about China's sustainable food future, talking about the year 2030, I think, along with some Chinese researchers.
Yeah.
I'd like to quote something from that paper. Despite formidable technological, social, educational, structural barriers that need to be overcome, our study indicates that the ambitious targets of China's new agricultural and environmental strategy appear to be achievable. That seems like a very optimistic conclusion. But I'd like to know, what are the formidable barriers that you mention, and how can a country that clearly is on its way to 1.8 billion even think about feeding itself when it couldn't come to that conclusion maybe 20 years ago, when they had perhaps 650 million people? They were still wondering, how can we feed ourselves? You're suggesting that heading into 1.8 billion, that it's possible. So tell me about the barriers and why you think they can be overcome.
I'm not a person who spends a lot of time worrying about doomsday scenarios, because in the end, we need to look for ways forward. And that's why I tend to generally be a bit more optimistic maybe than a few other people, although I don't ignore the threats that we have to face. So the first point to note is, I think that China has in fact succeeded in feeding its massive population. That is unprecedented at that scale. Or if you look at compared to where they were during the Great Leap Forward period, with millions of people dying, if you wish, and where China is now in terms of economic development and its ability to feed its people, maybe to the extent that they're eating too much already. So I think the Chinese government has always been extremely conscious about food security, much more than any other government of a big country in this world. In the UK, I don't think we have a clear food security strategy. For example, we rely on the supply chains of 6 or 7 supermarket companies, and think that we can always get what we want from anywhere in the world. China cannot afford this because there are just too many of them. It would be, and they've seen with their own eyes the political risk if food is ignored. So they've had until recently a policy that was largely driven by the need to achieve 95% food self-sufficiency for major staple crops, such as rice, for example, or wheat, that they felt was absolutely basis for China. So in recent years, I think around beginning in 2015, there has been a rethinking in a sense that the implications of high-yielding intensive agriculture on the environment are too strong to even ignore in China. So there are concerns about soil acidification, air pollution, water pollution, health issues. So, and that has led to the new environmental and agricultural policies, which were actually developed by a group of ministries, including the Ministry of Finance, which is very important. So, and various elements of that I find particularly interesting. The one that interests me most is a key element of the new Chinese policy is to achieve all future growth in agricultural productivity. They recognize that yields need to grow, or efficiencies, all future growth with net zero growth in input use. So no more absolute increase in the use of fertilizer, water for irrigation, land used for agriculture, pesticides in particular. I don't know of any other country that has ever stated that kind of ambition that clearly. But now, of course, the scientific community and others are challenged with how you do this, after all your growth before has been driven by input growth. So in the paper, we took that as the backbone, to look at using a model that actually models the entire food system of China based on the nutrient flows. And we look at the question of what would you have to, in theory, do to achieve that, And the key components are technology improvement. So there's still scope in terms of efficiency and yields, purely from a science and technology point of view. And even it's not just inventing new stuff, but it's also actually adoption by farmers of good practices. So huge potential still in China. I've conducted many experiments there where we could show that you can get the same yield of rice with half the amount of nitrogen that the farmers were using. Others have done the same in wheat and maize, or cutting back on pesticides. Huge potential there. So, but of course, it won't be easy, and there are barriers. So, and the barriers, I think, are by and large, in my view, first of all, the thinking and behavior of people. And that is farmers as well as consumers. So farmers need to see that, okay, you can grow things differently. And there are many new ways of doing this, and the technologies exist or can be invented, and it is a benefit for you. And that needs to be also supported by government policy. On the consumer side, of course, if China follows the Western consumer model in terms of further massive rises of meat consumption or meat-based diets, it will always be a challenge for China to be food secure. So you will end up massively importing things because you cannot grow enough in China. So that behavior change in terms of diets towards a healthier diet is probably one of the most important factors in China And that is not easy to achieve, because now you've had a generation of people who have greatly enjoyed in the last 20 years a massive economic growth, and if anything, want to spend even more money, earn and spend it, So the behavior changes of that kind. I don't think there is a massive barrier in terms of the ability of science and technology to come up with new things. There's still many things that China hasn't used even yet. For example, GM crops, very little used except for GM cotton. So despite a lot of investment, billions of dollars invested in China, they haven't actually released much. And then, of course, perhaps the biggest barriers on the political side are land ownership and land reform, and then the policy systems to incentivize the better practices. I think China will have to find a way to reach a certain level of aggregations of small farms so that they become a bit more sophisticated in management and also economically more viable and attractive to young people. And initially, the Chinese government thought of, okay, bigger farms of the Western kind. But they've very recently actually concluded, no, this is not the Chinese model. We need something that is smaller, but bigger than the current small farms. But for China, it's not going to be the American-style farm.
So this Chinese buying up farmland in various other places, in Africa and Asia, and Australasia, of course, seems like that's an effort to feed its own people from other countries. Was that something you thought about in your analysis?
No, we didn't explicitly account for this because we don't believe that this is a major factor. Of course, in the analysis, in the model, we have an import component in the scenarios, and that implicitly implies, okay, you could import some of the food that might be produced in other countries under Chinese investments. But the point I would make is that this, the concerns about land grab mainly started to occur after the food price crisis in 2008. And it, of course, hit the press often also with lots of unverified claims. So subsequent studies that in more recent years have been conducted have actually shown that a lot of the land grab that people have stated has happened actually never happened. I think investors, not just Chinese, but also Saudi Arabian or others, had completely underestimated the difficulty in actually getting these kind of projects on the ground in Africa, including the legal implications in terms of land ownership. And many of them have actually never happened. So I don't think it has been as anywhere near as big as it has been mentioned. I think it has been often exaggerated also in the press or by certain NGOs for a variety of reasons. I will say, though, that I belong to the group of people who believe that without large-scale foreign investment, Africa will find it difficult to feed itself. I see a lot of underinvested or underutilized land in Africa, which is of actually pretty good quality and will only be made productive with the right kind of investment. If you go to Mozambique, for example, just to name one country, and it's a huge country, it's over 1,000 kilometers from south to north, and you drive through the big two river plains there, the Limpopo and the Zambezi areas, you see huge tracts of what I would describe potentially highly fertile soils, but for the most part of the year, very little grown. So Africa will need that and has a lot more potential, but without foreign investment of the right kind, of the socially and environmentally acceptable and sustainable kind, I don't think it can do it by itself.
So what about fresh water supply? There's a real crisis here too. China, India, Middle East. Has organic agriculture got anything to say in that respect?
Declining groundwater tables. You have that in parts of the US, in the Indo-Gangetic Plain, in South Asia and China. So these are huge issues. I think they are also not easy to correct because they would require very strong political action and regulation, which is not popular in some places. But to me, water is one of the big challenges also for Africa. I personally believe that Africa cannot feed itself without making better use of its water resources. A lot of water is not used in Africa. So I'm not talking about large-scale dam projects and irrigation schemes, which are not popular. I'm talking about new forms of smarter water use and technologies for that, which I think Africa will need.
This question about 30,000 edible food plants and yet only cropping about 200 comes from a colleague of mine who's just written a book called Food or War. His name is Julian Cribb. He's an Australian science writer. What do you make of that kind of a statement? Okay, we've got 30,000, yet we're only cropping 200.
Yeah, in principle, 30,000 plants may be edible, but it doesn't mean that all of them are very producible. So, or in a way that actually, would be viable. But if they were and had the desirable features, I'm pretty sure people will make more use of it. And so it's partially happening now. You see more sort of, I would call them exotic foods appearing. Not all of that is particularly great. I mean, the effect that the quinoa boom had on the actual local quinoa farmers and prices in Peru, for example, was not particularly positive, so making it almost unaffordable there, until somewhere else it is produced. So I'm always in favor of diversifying crops, and we need more crops in our rotations anyway for a variety of reasons. So if there's a market and people want it, and if there is supporting research to help develop these types of crops, it would be great to have them, yeah.
How can an organic agriculture stem the loss of more than 75 billion tons of topsoil every year? Mostly, it seems, displaced by agriculture.
Well, we have to be realistic. I mean, I think if I'm right, at present, organic farming is about something like 1% of global agriculture. Isn't much more than that. Of course, it varies from place to place. In some countries, much higher. In Europe, in particular, yeah. And yes, I've seen claims and also papers that have appeared this year again and in recent years where people say organic farming or organic agriculture, in whatever way you define it, can feed the world. But I don't believe that's possible, and certainly not for everything that we need to grow and everywhere. So it's just not scalable. People make these calculations or models often based on single crop comparisons, but you need to look at an entire system. If you are a small farm right now and you go organic, you can probably, and you have enough land, you can have a crop rotation that includes some legumes that fix your nitrogen. You would still need to find an outside source to replace potassium or phosphorus, because that doesn't come from the air. Or you may get some manure from another farmer who might be a conventional farmer or whatever, and through that manure you get things. But if everybody was going to do this, where is it supposed to come from? So we would probably need to dedicate 20 or 30% of the agricultural land in the world to growing crops that we cannot eat, but produce nutrients for the organically grown crops or animals that we want to eat, So it just doesn't work, and you still don't replace some other nutrients, So I think we need to be realistic in terms of the role of organic farming. I think it is an important and growing niche, and I would encourage anyone who wants to try to do it, as a farmer. And some do, and some also stop doing it again after a while because it's difficult. And if there is a market for it, it can play a role. And by and large, if you have an organic system that has more organic inputs of various kinds, crop residues or green manure or manure, of course, it will be, on average, good for the soil. it'll increase your soil organic matter content faster than not having these organic inputs. And you'll get better soil structure and maybe therefore also less erosion, And with the organic system, you tend to have also a crop coverage for most of the year. That's kind of implicit in design. So yeah, in principle, it's beneficial. I just don't believe it's scalable to the extent that it can be the one and only solution for the world.
Current world investment in agricultural R&D, about 70 billion a year, very little of which goes to organic methods. How can we redress the balance? Does it need to be redressed? Some suggest we should, for example, reallocate funds from the world's military expenditures.
That would be a very good idea. I'm all for that. I think the amounts of money that are being spent on agricultural R&D are far too small in general. 70 billion sounds like a lot, but it's a tiny proportion compared to what we spend on other things in the world. I think general guidance is that countries that have already a pretty decent degree of agricultural development should spend at least 1.5% of their agricultural GDP on R&D, better 2 or 2.5% to stay up front. And low-income countries, for which agriculture is even more important as part of the overall food security and economy, should be spending up to 10%. Very few countries in the world reach these kind of targets. So for me, the first measure is to increase the pot in general. And then the second one is to also spend more of that money on the more future, more forward-looking solutions, of which organic farming is one, but not the only one here. So I also, for example, see a huge gap in investment for what I would describe as good agronomy research. There's a lot of money going into biotech or chemicals, things that are more attractive to as products or breeding in general. But when it comes to changing management practices of farmers and thinking and the behavior towards better, more sustainable systems, we don't have that level of investment. And organic farming is part of that.
The economic key to successful organic farming is consumer awareness, willingness to pay a premium perhaps for sustainable methods. How do we accelerate the rate of adoption of organic food?
I really don't know, to be honest. So, I mean, what we can see is, of course, that probably particularly in urban areas, people get more and more used to organic produce. And if I go around in town here and look at the supermarkets, you will find a lot. And some of it you even subconsciously or unconsciously buy without knowing that it is organic because you don't look at it anymore. So it doesn't actually sit in shelves that say organic, it just is part of the normal shelves. And that's perhaps for me the right strategy. If it can ultimately compete better with normal products in terms of price and quality, or gets close to that, I think that'll be the point where you will see much more broader uptake. If it always requires a significant premium, it will essentially mean that we're catering to the wealthy who can, for whatever reasons, afford this, or to a few people who, for lifestyle reasons, want to live more sustainable. Also, so the processors and retail companies have. They tell me that they would love to sell more locally produced things, or more organic, or both. But all of their consumer surveys show that people kind of want it, but as soon as they're being faced with the price question, they go back to say, well, it needs to be as cheap as the other stuff.
Is there a difference between organic and regenerative agriculture?
Big into definitions. People throw all kind of names around, and sometimes they don't really know what they're talking about anymore. I think organic agriculture, organic farming is typically more associated with some kind of certified practices or certification schemes that often then also have to have a certain monitoring aspect to it, because you're selling certified organic food to a local market or whatever, a lot of potential cheating may have, of course, happen there too. I think regenerative agriculture is a general set of principles and practices to improve your topsoil, largely. I think that's what it is largely about, So, and that can be many of the things that I even talked about already. So even conservation agriculture, types of approaches, better crop rotations, cover crops, other agroecological measures, or the introduction of or going from a conventional livestock farming to a grazing livestock system. These are all types of regenerative farming. And in principle, they do not need, in my view, they're not the same as organic farming, because you can do these practices in combination with more conventional technology. You could even do it in combination with GM crops or with mineral fertilizers or pesticides. So for me, it represents more of the what I would generally call good agronomic practices kind. So from that point of view, I feel that has more potential, broader potential than the more specialized organic farming market.
So the fly in the ointment in getting producers to make radical changes, we've been talking about getting people to make changes, especially the food production, is often our selfish side. Soil erosion, soil degradation, pollution, all these problems we've been talking about can be linked, perhaps, to profit at all costs motivation. So what can be done about that?
This is, for me, actually the biggest question, and I don't have an answer for you. So because it goes to the questioning the fundamentals of capitalism as a form of economy, so which is based on profit. So and of course there are versions of that in certain parts of the world, which is more of a social type of capitalism where it is meant to be more socially acceptable and to some extent giving away some of that profit or more of that profit. That goes in the right direction. So, but it is not easy to change this, and this constant drive for economic growth is what is creating us the biggest problems. When you look at the global economy in the last decades, it has always grown despite some ups and downs at a rate of 3 to 4% a year, worldwide. And at that rate of growth, it doubles the global economy in every generation of human beings. So, if you think about the problems that we currently have, and you think in 20 years the economy will be twice as big as it is now, globally speaking, and imagine the problems that we have with that. At some point, I don't know how to cope with this anymore. And it's also difficult because that of the 7-something billion people that we currently have, perhaps about 6 billion still have the right to improve their lives, and we cannot tell them not to do this, So what is our moral justification for saying, well, you shouldn't be doing this, because it's too bad for the planet, So how to reconcile that, and who's going to be willing to make cuts, if you wish, in our lifestyle, in our desire for profit, in our consumption, so that the others can still improve, and on balance, we don't make the world worse. Well, that's the biggest challenge that I can see.
You said earlier that generally you're an optimistic person. You would prefer to be optimistic. What we're faced with here is a somewhat pessimistic end to this interview.
I was part of the process that led to the formulation of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. So I chaired a little working group that provided one stream of technical input, which then the politicians used to come up with these goals. And I thought that the fact even though you can argue that 17 goals and 163 or so targets is far too much for anybody to remember and do anything about it, we had actually proposed 10 goals, 30 targets, and 100 indicators so that it could be manageable. But politics is always a compromise problem. Yeah. But the fact that actually for the first time, the entire group of countries in the world in the United Nations agreed to something of this scope, saying, okay, these are in principle ways towards a more sustainable development. Here we have some goals and some targets. And one way or another, we need to do something about it. So for me, the fact that they did agree to this was a success. Now, will they reach all these targets? No, of course not, because they are getting sidetracked by their day-to-day political needs and things that are unpredictable. But one way or another, they will keep thinking about them, and they'll come back to them, and there will be an action group or a ministry in this country or this country tasks with, okay, what can we do in our country to meet sustainable development goal number 2, which is on food, So we need these kind of things. If you do not have them, if you do not have any kind of guiding framework or ambition and leave it to everybody else, then some will do something about it and some won't do anything. So that is the part that still keeps me reasonably optimistic, although I'd love to see a lot more action on it and a lot more concrete investment in it than we have at present.
Thank you.